Jill Biden thought she could silence Senator Kennedy with one sharp order, but just 49 seconds later, his icy response turned the entire room against her live on national television. The studio was a crucible of light and sound, a carefully orchestrated arena where every gesture, every word was amplified for the world to dissect. The cameras, perched like vigilant sentinels, captured every angle of the stage, their red lights blinking in rhythm with the pulse of the moment. Overhead, the studio lights blazed with an intensity that seemed to strip away pretense, casting stark shadows on the polished floor. The audience, a sea of faces packed tightly into tiered seats, sat in a state of suspended anticipation, their collective breath held as the tension in the room reached a fever-pitch dot at the center of it all. Was Dr. Jill Biden, poised and commanding in her tailored navy blazer, her posture radiating authority. Her presence was no accident. She had spent decades navigating the political spotlight, first as a senator's wife, then as Second Lady, and now as First Lady. Tonight, she was here to assert her voice in a high-stakes forum, a televised debate on policy that had drawn millions of viewers. Her role was not just to speak, but to dominate, to steer the conversation with the kind of gravitas that silenced dissent. Opposite her sat Senator John Kennedy, the Louisiana Republican known for his folksy charm and razor-sharp wit, his weathered face betraying little of the calculations behind his eyes. The topic had been education reform, a subject Jill Biden had made her own through years of advocacy and teaching. She had been eloquent, her arguments polished, her delivery measured yet passionate. The audience had nodded along, swayed by her conviction. But Kennedy, ever the contrarian, had interjected with a question pointed, provocative, and laced, with his signature Southern drawl. It wasn't an attack, not exactly, but it was enough to shift the momentum, to make the room feel suddenly smaller. The air denser. Jill Biden's response was immediate and sharp, her voice cutting through the studio like a whip. "Senator Kennedy, I'm going to have to ask you to stop speaking," she said, leaning forward in her chair. Her eyes locked on his. It was a power move, the kind of directive meant to assert dominance and end the exchange in one clean stroke. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality, and for a heartbeat the room obeyed. The audience froze, the moderators exchanged quick glances, and the cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment in excruciating detail. This was it, the decisive blow, the kind of moment that would be clipped, shared, and celebrated as a masterclass in control. But John Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't shrink back or offer a deferential nod. Instead, he sat still, his hands folded calmly on the table, his gaze steady and unyielding. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring, and in that stillness, something shifted. The audience sensed it, the moderators felt it, and even the cameras seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what came next. Kennedy's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not mocking, but knowing, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, each word delivered with the cadence of a man who knew exactly how to wield language as a weapon. "With all due respect, Dr. Biden," he began, his Louisiana accent softening the edges of his steel, "I wasn't finished, and I reckon the folks watching at home might like to hear the rest of what I have to say." The words were simple, almost conversational, but they landed with the precision of a marksman's bullet. The audience stirred, a murmur rippling through the crowd. Reporters in the back of the room, their pens poised over notepads, exchanged glances, sensing the story unfolding before them. Jill Biden, who moments earlier had been the picture of control, now sat motionless, her expression caught somewhere between surprise and calculation. Her hands, which had been gesturing emphatically just minutes ago, now rested stiffly on the table. The room waited for her to counter, to reclaim the moment with the same force she'd wielded seconds before. But the seconds ticked by 5, 10, 15, and she said nothing. The silence was deafening, a void that amplified Kennedy's quiet triumph. In 49 seconds, the tide had turned. What had been Jill Biden's moment of authority had become John Kennedy's masterstroke. He didn't need to raise his voice or resort to theatrics. His calm, measured response had done the work. It was a reminder of his reputation not just as a politician, but as a storyteller, a man who could disarm with a quip and dismantle with a glance. The audience, once firmly in Jill Biden's corner, now leaned forward, captivated by the shift in power. The moderators, sensing the need to regain control, tried to steer the conversation back to policy, but the moment was indelible. The exchange would dominate headlines for days. "Kennedy stuns Biden in debate showdown," one outlet would proclaim. "Jill Biden's command crumbles in 49 seconds. Another would write, with a clip of the moment racking up millions of views online. Pundits would dissect Kennedy's tone, his pause, the way his eyes never left hers. They would debate whether Jill Biden's silence was strategic or a misstep, whether she'd been outmaneuvered or simply caught off guard on social media. Memes would proliferate, Kennedy's drawl remixed into sound bites, Jill Biden's frozen expression captured in stills, but in the studio, in that fleeting moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the electric charge in the air, the unspoken acknowledgement that something significant had just occurred. It wasn't just a debate point won or lost. It was a clash of wills, a test of presence under pressure. John Kennedy had stood his ground, not with bluster but with precision, and in doing so, he had turned the spotlight squarely on himself. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the sound of a narrative shifting, of a moment that would echo far beyond the studio walls. As the moderators moved to the next question, the audience settled back into their seats, but the energy in the room had changed. Jill Biden regained her composure, her voice steady as she returned to her points, but the memory of those 49 seconds lingered. For John Kennedy, it was a reminder of why he was a force to be reckoned with, a senator who could wield wit like a blade and turn a moment of challenge into a triumph. And for those watching, it was a masterclass in the art of the comeback, a fleeting but unforgettable glimpse of political theater at its finest.